All right, today's topic is one that has been requested probably more than any other topic, and I have been avoiding it for so long. We're going to talk about autism and how being on the autism spectrum is going to affect you dating. But let me just provide a disclaimer first about the reason why I've avoided this is because I I don't have autism. I'm not on the spectrum in any sense. And so I've always felt nervous about kind of speaking on the behalf of something that I don't really have much experience of. But over the course of doing this channel, I've done a number of first private consultations and now these Hey Hero consultations with men who are on the spectrum and so tell me about their experiences. And so through that, I've managed to collate a lot of data. So please don't take anything that I'm going to say in this video as though I'm speaking in any way authoritatively. I'm just doing my best to be able to present the information as it's been presented to me and then my interpretations. And so from the outset, what I want to do is please an invitation to all of the people who are part of this treasured Patreon community. If you're on the spectrum and you have some valuable data that you want to share or you want to correct me or add to something that I've added, please, 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 you're so welcome to. The comment section of this video is going to be just as valuable as what Matt and I talk about. Matt, let me just get this out of the way first. Do you feel like you're on the spectrum of autism in any way, or does that not describe you?
I have a very weird personality, and so it wouldn't surprise me, but I have never been formally diagnosed. I haven't actually spent enough time talking to psychologists to get me figured out, but as far as I know, I'm not on the spectrum at all. And I also want to just very briefly echo everything you just said. While I am studying psychology formally, I haven't spent a whole lot of time studying autism, and so I very well may say some things that are just inaccurate or mischaracterized, and so feel free to correct me. I would love to learn more.
I'm nervous about this one. Just everybody know our intentions are good and we're both here as students completely sort of willing to learn. But one of the difficulties is I think autism is quite difficult to sort of understand. I think we may have even committed a faux pas already because maybe perhaps as I understand it is that everybody is somewhere on the spectrum. Like the idea of autism as being either something you have or don't have. I think they've started to even get rid of that distinction. It's like, no, it just presents itself more sort of strongly. And I know that there are some women who have autism as well, but I think as far as I understand, it does present more strongly in men. And sometimes the way people have kind of described it is that, hey, Alexander, when you're talking about men not really understanding their emotions, being like a little bit socially awkward, very kind of black and white and logical with their thinking, autism is just like that squared, it's just like the Ultraman, sort of like it's difficulty to read those social cues. It's difficult to understand those emotions in others. So all the problems that you talk about for men, they just kind of apply in a stronger sense for men who are on the spectrum. And like, I would probably consider myself perhaps almost as far away from autism as you can kind of get, in that I'm quite a feminine man, in that I love emotions. I'm very sensitive. I love social connections. I love all of that stuff. Like, I'm not like a typical manly kind of man, but I think I'm managing to actually strike a chord with a lot of men who are struggling in dating who are on the spectrum, because my way of communicating, I think, is to try and break down very complex emotional social phenomena into a logical kind of way of thinking. So I would consider it a success if I was able to take some inexplicable female behavior, like, hey, some women doing this, and it's like, why are they doing that? That makes no sense. If I can try and break it down into logical terms for the male mind, then that's what I consider a success. And so the first thing that I would say is going to be difficult for autistic men is that as much as it's difficult for men to try and create a separate set of programming in their mind to try and understand how women see the world, which is so different to how men see the world, if you're on the autism spectrum, you have the added challenge of not just understanding how women think, but how neurotypical people think, because there's also a gap between you and men who are not on the spectrum, just sort of people. But the principle, I think, would largely remain the same, is that whatever, like, principles you've applied in just trying to sort of understand, neurotypical people and function in society, to understand women is just going to be another extension of that. And I'm happy to report that I had a number of consultations with men who tell me that they went from being very hopeless in the dating market and thought that their autism was to blame, but through sustained effort, they were able to learn these things, imitate them, and then ultimately find a lot of success. And we'll talk about the potential advantages of autism in just a moment to the degree that they're there. But I want to make that point first too, that everybody is going to be on the spectrum in a different place. And so it's difficult to speak about autism as some kind of a whole, because I know that in its most extreme cases, you can even find men and women who are not really verbal, they have difficulty functioning with anything. But there are also people, and I know a couple in my real life, who will tell me that they were autistic, they have on the autism spectrum, and I wouldn't know. But then when you talk about them, they're like, yeah, so when I'm doing this, I don't really feel what you're feeling. I'm just kind of going through the motions. It's sort of an imitation. And I find it a fascinating experience speaking to somebody who has the self-awareness to be able to describe how they're different to how I'm different. But I've just thrown a lot of words at you, Matt. I want to give you the opportunity to sort of jump in now.
Oh, I appreciate you sharing that you have these people in your life. I have a close friend of mine. He's much older than me. I think he's in his 70s now, and he's married and has 2 children, and he's done very well for himself. And he's got a long-term marriage, and they're great. And he is his son is quite strongly autistic, and is relatively high functioning. And he, my friend, is most of the way there. And to hear him reflect on his life and how he is essentially he's reverse engineered understanding the sort of emotional intuition that a lot of us seem to take for granted. It's really interesting to hear his perspective on humans. He's done a great job of learning to connect all these dots very consciously, and so he's become quite insightful. But he does seem to speak about humans almost like they're an alien species. Sometimes he has that kind of distance, and he does frequently find himself in situations of conflict or in a misunderstanding. And it takes him a second to realize what happened when everyone else around him is like, we see exactly what happened. So it's in a certain sense, it still plagues him, but in another sense, it's become a bit of a superpower because he really has learned people in a very deep sense. And so, yeah, it's just, I can relate slightly because I have such an extreme personality myself on the Big Five model, which I've talked about in other recordings. And that has certainly plagued me in aspects of my life, but it has also been a superpower. And so I can relate somewhat to being weird. And especially I can relate to not really wanting to accept that I am in fact weird. And yet when I finally accepted that about myself, it explained a whole lot, and then it allowed me some agency to work with it rather than just being in denial of it for years on end like I was growing up.
It can be difficult to hear you describe yourself as weird because whatever your particular, atypical neurological makeup is, you've clearly made it into such a functional personality that it would have been interesting to know you back before you really felt like you got a master on who you are and how you're functioning. And perhaps that's how it is for some autistic people on the autism spectrum, is that for a long time life could seem confusing or even frightening or just kind of pointless. I don't know how to describe it, but the more and more they learn to work with their neurological makeup, they can find their own kind of way. And it could even be surprising, like the people I know that's like, oh wow, you're on the spectrum. Because to me it seems like, you could almost term it as a sort of social disability, in that I think that a lot of the things that when I'm in a social situation, I just feel, I don't totally understand logically. I kind of make it my job to try and understand it logically so I can explain it to other people. But so much of it is unconscious. It's just emotional. It's a compassion. It's an empathy sort of thing that, I hate to overuse the word, but it's like a vibe. When you can feel out the sort of vibe of a situation, you know what's right. The thought of trying to navigate that without having the same like emotional radar, I suppose, seems extremely stressful to me. And so it doesn't surprise me that your friend's son will occasionally make those kind of faux pas, because his antenna is not going to be as automatic. It's going to be slowed by the necessity of processing thoughts, that he can't just vibe right there in the moment. And that probably strikes me as one of the biggest downsides of somebody who's on the spectrum when it comes to dating, is that while they might be able to find a long-term relationship, explain how they function, how they see the world to their partner and make it work, I would imagine one of the most difficult things to do is to just get your foot in the door and actually generate attraction with women, because women are so sensitive to a man's social competence. And so much of a man's social competence is displayed by quick reactions in the moment that kind of take control of it, like making a well-timed joke, teasing a woman at the right moment, knowing when to touch her, when not to touch her, knowing when to be loud, soft, whatever it might be. Is that there has to be a I think for that attraction, flirtation, it's difficult to make that process an intellectual one. It kind of has to be sort of about the emotions. And so I think from what I've seen, that's what people on the spectrum struggle with the most, is just getting in there and flirting and creating that kind of vibe, that sexual attraction. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, this is actually one of the most crucial aspects of a game, which is very hard to explain consciously and logically to people, which is that this is something I remember when we did our first Thailand trip. I remember asking the guys this question one time, and they all pretty much knew what I was talking about. And I said, do you remember that time in your life where you were with a woman and things were just going perfectly and you knew what to say and you knew how to feel and you were just totally in your masculine identity, and it worked out well for you in the end, right? And pretty much I think every guy there was like, yep, I've been there. I said, okay, game is just that. It's just being that guy. Now that's so vague and useless. It's almost as useless as just be yourself. But that actually is the answer, is that it's this sort of energetic vibe that you learn to embody. It's like an archetype, and then it programs all your behavior for you. And that is the simplest way to learn game. You can, in fact, mechanically go through and learn body language and vocal tonality and eye contact and all kinds of routines and whatnot. And that does work, but it's so much easier to just let it emerge as a real personality. And so if you don't have access to that easily with human relationships, then you're going to have to do it the hard way. But if you do it the hard way, that means you really master it. And so this actually opens the door into where you might have some benefits if you're on the spectrum.
Man, it's a really good explanation. I really enjoyed hearing that, and it makes me think about how the pickup artist industry community evolved over the years, in that it started off more appealing to somebody who's on the spectrum, and that we're going to break this down by this and this and explain everything and memorize this. But as time went on, it evolved a lot more into a self-help kind of community, more like, no, I just want to put you in the right state of mind, and then everything else is going to flow from that. And so almost like a sort of Buddhist exercise. It's like, right, forget all the rules. I just want to elevate your consciousness to a particular part. But that potentially leaves men who are more on the spectrum a little bit more in the dust. And perhaps that's actually why you've seen an explosion of channels a little bit more like mine, which are less about the actual, here's the technique of how to seduce a woman. Like that part of interactions are more about explaining female psychology. It's speaking more to a market of men who just getting the vibe right, just feeling it is not enough. They need those intellectual steps in order to be able to function.
Yeah, it's different markets, you know. Some people, there was a time in my life where I really needed to have someone mechanically walk me through why my body language was terrible, or why the weird thing my eyes were doing was sending a bad message, not just to the women around me, but to other people in general. And then as I've developed and as I've grown and as I've had more experience, then it's just about referencing past successes and then tapping into that, translating it and sending it forward. And so it would depend wherever you're starting, there should be, and ideally there will be, a way forward from there. It's just a matter of, do you have the discipline and the wherewithal to actually find the information, which is hopefully available to you.
Have you ever heard of the term the accidental alpha?
Yeah. Yeah. But tell me about it. It sounds great.
You know how in a lot of like the pickup artists, like the techniques they might be recommending are things like, you know, don't be too reactive, don't be too eager to please, you know, just sort of, you know, stay in your frame, make her try and sort of impress you. Is I've read stories online from men who are on the autism spectrum who are just sort of gobsmacked that one night, for some reason, they just seemed to be on, and there was just some girl who was crazy attracted to them, because what was actually happening inside them, which was a nervousness, like a shyness, not really knowing what to say to her, came across as a sort of disinterested, almost cocky, like dismissive kind of attitude. And she interpreted his behavior as though the guy is like super alpha, and then responded to him, which then getting that kind of response from her boosted his confidence, so he was better able to get into that state where he was actually saying the right things. And it just listening to what you were saying reminded me of that, because that could be one of the potential advantages of somebody who's on the spectrum, in that if you are too emotional, too sensitive, too tuned in to what women are experiencing and feeling, then there could be the danger of being overly reactive and giving up your frame. Whereas somebody who's on the spectrum, who's very self-referential, they're kind of just taking in the world at their own pace and according to their own values, and sort of, women coming in, it's almost like extraneous data. And that slightly dismissive attitude could actually be an advantage. It would be interesting to read the comment section to find out if any men on the spectrum have had that experience and what it was like.
There's another context in which I've seen this work, and I've seen this work personally, and as well as seen it in other people, is when I'll just use myself as example. When I speak only a little bit of the language of that the woman in front of me speaks, and so I don't actually have a lot of content that I can work with. All I have is my confidence and my facial expressions and my charm, especially if there's music or something. The conversation gets very simplified and it becomes very kind of, I don't want to say primal, but very, very basic. And if there's attraction, just physical attraction and a little bit of, zest and flirtation, then having more language would probably be a hindrance, because then I get in my head about saying the right things as opposed to just saying anything at all, even if it only makes half sense, and then just, getting into the flow. And so I've seen that work surprisingly well for a lot of guys.
It is shocking to me how little you need to say when the vibe is good. When she's attracted to you.
Oh, you can say nothing at all. Yeah.
Totally. If you were to take, how in a court of law, they might read a transcript of a situation, like a highly charged, emotionally charged argument, where people are throwing insults at each other, but then the court stenographer reads it out and it just seems like deadpan. If you took the people's flirtatious conversations and you read it out like a transcript, and you didn't have the music, the vibe, the attraction, or anything like that, you'd be like, this is the dumbest fucking conversation I've ever heard. How are these people, they seem so socially awkward, they're just talking nonsense or whatever. But that's the truth about attraction, is that when the vibe is on, it doesn't really matter what you say. It just matters that you keep going, just keep leaning into that energy. You can say really stupid stuff. And if the girl's attracted to you, she'll be endlessly forgiving. She's not wanting to snap out of that state and be like, that was a strange thing that you said. She's just eating it up, But I think to somebody who's on the spectrum, that can be very confusing, because they're looking at kind of the surface, like black and white, what is it about him saying that caused her to be attraction? That doesn't make sense. And it's it wasn't that. It was something indefinable. It's hard to sort of explain. Very, very frustrating. But it made me think about a client I have who I work with on Hey Hero, who has a lot of success, or had a lot of success picking up, because of this frame issue, in that even though he didn't understand necessarily what she was feeling in that moment, he knew through trial and error how he could act and what he could say and what kind of a reaction it was going to get. And that actually ended up being enough, at least until the point when they're sleeping together and potentially exploring a relationship. And just before we finish this discussion, I want to get away from just talking about pickup and actually talk about relationships, about how autistic men might function in a relationships, and an interesting question as to what kind of a woman might actually feel more comfortable with an atypical thinking man. Do you have any insight on that one?
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on something very briefly, which ties into this quite well, that there's something called having an internal frame, which basically means that you assess the quality of your own work, as opposed to having an external frame, which means you are seeking validation from outside, and you don't want to have a purely internal frame, because if 99% of the population is insisting on something about you, it's probably a good idea to listen. But for the most part, most men that I know could do better to have a more internal frame, even if what they're doing actually isn't very good, just for their own self-esteem's sake. And so this is something, the accidental alpha, that a lot of men who are maybe not fully, it depends on how far on the spectrum they happen to be, but if they're just a little bit on the spectrum, they tend to do better in trusting their own competence when they have the intellectual backing behind it. And so, I'm sorry, I forgot what your question was.
About women who might, I agree with you, just to put that out there, but...
good, okay.
About women who might intentionally seek out a man who's on the spectrum for a relationship partner.
So if the man has that internal frame and has some of those more subtle, I don't want to say symptoms, but aspects of being on the spectrum, and yet has done well for himself because he's followed through on actually achieving some of the status that is generally attractive to women, that actually sounds like a pretty good deal for a lot of women, assuming that he is open to learning to navigate her emotions and all of their possible perplexity, because he may have some trouble with that. But if he's done well for himself professionally, if he's taken good care of himself, if he's risen up in society and he is a little bit imperturbable, then all he needs basically is the willingness to learn about her. And you don't need to learn about all women. You really just need to learn about one woman, because each woman will have her own subtle way of explaining and doing things. And you can come up with systems. This is what me and my partner have. We have systems to understand each other's differences because we are radically different personalities. And so a lot of the knowledge I picked up from my, life as in dating doesn't apply anymore because my relationship has become so idiosyncratic. And that could apply to someone who is on the spectrum.
Yeah, that's really good advice and very true. I resonate with that a lot. The other thing that I'll say is that while I tend to speak in my channel as though women need emotional competence and they crave that and things like that, there is actually a percentage of women out there who, for whatever reason, are not interested in getting in touch with even in their own emotions. That's frightening to them. They want to repress them. And so I have noticed that women who have perhaps been a little bit traumatized and are not very emotionally self-aware might intentionally seek out a man on the spectrum because they feel like that's a good way of avoiding their own emotional kind of pain by being with somebody who's not comfortable in that arena anyway. And so they're not going to get pushed there. Or if they are going to go there, it's going to go on their terms. So you can imagine how some like new age hippie guru kind of guy who's just all about the feelings, for a certain like uptight kind of woman who doesn't want to explore her emotions, he would be a nightmare for her to date. And so when she sees a man on the spectrum who's just like, yeah, I'm happy, like life's pretty logical, I'm just making these things, she's like, this guy, this is the guy, I'm gonna hitch my ride onto that. But with that, I want to finish up the video, but then again invite everybody to share your insights, whether you're on the spectrum or not. What are your thoughts? Please provide us with data, information. Always want to learn. And thank you so much for watching. Anything else to say, Matt?
Nothing else at all. That was great.
All right, awesome. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks, guys.